respect the decorum of the council chambers. So, having said that, let's proceed. The agenda, there's a couple changes that I know of. First of all, under the delegation B, Dave Rohrer will not be here. Sandra Price is taking his place. We do have a public hearing, and one of the consent items is the report that deals with the item in the public hearing. So I'm going to remove that from the consent agenda and pair it with the public hearing. And I believe that's all the corrections. Does anyone have any additions they would like placed on the agenda? Seeing none, would someone move that the agenda be approved, noting that the addendum, there is an additional item? Moved by Brian, seconded by Mark. All those in favor? Motion's carried. There is the opportunity to declare pecuniary interest. Seeing none, let's move on to delegations. And actually, there's 3 items listed under delegations, and each one is a little bit different, and it's going to be handled a little bit different, so bear with me. The first item is a public hearing. Would someone move that we convene a public hearing to hear a request for an exemption to the noise bylaw? Moved by Mayor David, seconded by John. Any questions? All those in favor? Motion's carried. Okay. I'm going to ask perhaps the CAO if he can just give a brief synopsis of what the request is.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, the request is fairly straightforward. It's a provincial project, I believe, on Highway 24 to basically allow after-hours work to proceed.
Committee members, do you have any questions? Seeing no questions from the committee, it is a public hearing, and I will ask if there's anyone in the audience that wishes to speak to this request, either for or against, or perhaps have a question. And that is the noise bylaw request from Capital Paving. I'll ask a second time and a final time. Committee members, I see no questions, no input from the public. Perhaps we can have a motion to adjourn the public hearing. Moved by John, seconded Pierce, seconded by Joan. All those in favor? Motion's carried. As I stated at the beginning of the meeting, I'm going to move 7A1, and that's the recommendation dealing with the request for the exemption. We've just had the public hearing. How do you wish to deal with the issue? Brian? And seconded by David. Are there any questions to the motion? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Now, we have a real delegation, and that is Sandra Price and Sherry Kerr here to speak about the Community Charity Air Show. And as they are coming forward, I'll just remind them that we allot 10 minutes. Perhaps if you can contain your presentation within 10 minutes, we will have an opportunity for questions afterward. And you have the floor. Just remind you to speak right into the microphone.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum and the Rotary Club of Brantford, thank you to the Corporate Development Committee for having us here tonight. Every year we like to bring to County Council an overview of the Community Charity Air Show and, of course, ask for your support moving forward into the next year. So again, the Community Charity Air Show is brought to you on behalf of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum and the Rotary Club of Brantford in partnership. Some of the new things we did this year was we moved our fundraising dinner to the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. The fundraising dinner is an important component of the Community Charity Air Show. As you know, all the funds raised are used for both the charities of the Rotary Club of Brantford and the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. So actually moving the dinner out from Brantford to Hamilton to the Warplane Heritage Museum was a great success for us. We had a Lancaster flight. It was auctioned off at dinner, and one of our local sponsors actually won the flight, so it was a pretty exciting time for him to be able to go up in the Lancaster. The feature at the dinner was the Fifi burn off, which this is an amazing picture of the burn off, but it's just all the smoke and stuff burning off the propellers, so you can tell how much I know anything about flight. Particularly of importance to our air show this year was the Heritage Flight with the Lancaster and the CF-18. This was not shown anywhere else, certainly not in Ontario or in Canada. It was truly an exceptional experience to be had at our own air show. Snowbirds come every year. They're always an exciting feature of the air show. And for our local cadets, this is one of their highlights, being able to get up close and personal to the snowbirds, learn a little bit more about aviation from the snowbirds. CF-18, again, another feature that everybody likes, unless you're living close by and don't like air shows, then you might not like the noise so much. Again, another feature with the Lancaster being able to fly this year with the Fifi, another flight that wasn't seen anywhere else in other air shows here in Ontario. And these are a couple of our local acts. Trevor Lafferty is local. He comes almost every year to the air show, and Danny O'Shea, who's a local pilot as well, businessman, and he loves to be able to do his thing at an air show. And the B25, again, as you know, most of our assets do come from the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, but then we bring in some of our other special features to make it an exciting show. And our veterans always enjoy this show. We always make sure we have a veterans tent. It's well received. Brant County Fire is always on site and ready to respond, as well as a Brant County ambulance. The Works Department helps us with road closures, barriers, etc., where we need to have the road closures. The OPP Command Center is on site, and the OPP provides a lot of support right through planning to end day. Staff obviously provide us a lot of guidance around our road closures and just the planning. We do have a county staff liaison that comes out and plans with us all year, and as well the Tourism and Economic Development Committee does a lot of advertising and support because it is one of the main events in the county. So we certainly do appreciate the air show the way we do without your support. So just a brief on our revenue and expenses, which is important for us to be able to share with you. Our expenses this year totaled $124,000. It's an expensive event to put on. It was a little bit more expensive than last year. We had a few extra features this year. And revenue was more this year, obviously. Sorry, I got that backwards. $124,000 worth of revenue. Of course, the dinner certainly helped with the revenue. Our expenses were $71,000. Compared to last year, it was a bit of a boost to last year's show. And in total, we raised $52,461, which was split equally between the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum and the Rotary Club of Brantford. So again, on behalf of the Rotary Club of Brantford, I'd personally like to say thank you very much to the County of Brant for all of your support. And I think Sandra has some comments from David as well.
Thanks, Sherry. Good evening. Dave Rohr does apologize for not being able to be here tonight, but he asks that I pass on this message. The Canadian Warplane himself and myself are very pleased to partner with the County of Brant and the volunteers from the Rotary Club of Brantford to keep this unique air show alive and well. It helps our children in need and the local communities. We simply could not do it without your support and assistance, and for that we are truly grateful. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sandra. And just as a note, we're in the midst of planning for the 2019 air show, which the dinner will be held August 27th, the Tuesday, and August 28th, the Wednesday before Labor Day, will once again be the Community Charity Air Show, and we're happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. Are there any questions? John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, yeah, it was another fantastic show. It rained for a little bit. I think some people got wet, but just before the snowbirds, it cooperated, so that's fantastic. A couple questions I do have, though, and the dinner next year, is it going to be held in Hamilton as well? Because that was, you know, when it's, you know, $22,000 more than the year before, something was right when the way you did that. So I think you're on the right track with that. If we go down to the expenses part of it, a couple that just kind of jumped out at me with fuel. It was like, you know, $3,300 less. Is there something different that was done? Did we get a better deal on fuel? I'm just wondering the reason for that.
There may have been a small deal on the fuel, but it depended on what assets we had in terms of what the costs were. So we had a few more assets from the Canadian Airplane Heritage Museum than we did through other performers that were coming in outside on a contract, so it did reduce our fuel expenses.
Excellent. And if you could just elaborate a little bit on the other, because that seems to be way up this year. I'm just wondering, what is other?
This year we changed our announcer. In the past, our announcer has been a little bit less expensive, but we brought in Rick Peterson, who also does the Toronto Air Show, so his expenses were a little bit more. We did attend the NECAS this year. Last year we weren't able to attend any of the air show conferences, so we were able to attend the air show conference this year. And what else is in that? Just some canopy rentals around the veterans canopy that we rented.
Okay. Thank you very much. I look forward to next year.
Yes, thank you very much.
Any other questions? How does the committee wish to deal with the delegation? Brian?
Move to receive and then refer the request to budget.
Do I have a seconder? Mayor Bailey? Any questions? All those in favor? Opposed? That motion is carried. And we are just beginning our budget session, and we will let you know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, our next delegation, again, really isn't a delegation per se, it's a workshop. And we have two gentlemen here from Watson and Associates to bring us up to date as to where they're at with our development charges review. As they are moving forward to the podium, I'm just going to ask our CAO to perhaps introduce them and perhaps introduce why they're here and what is expected of us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so I think it's been mentioned in some of our orientation session, the county is in the midst of moving into its 5-year deadline with its development charges background study. So you will need to pass a new development charges background study and a new bylaw this year, 2019. The process to arrive at that new background study and bylaw started last year with the retention of Watson and Associates, who have done development charge background studies and bylaws for the county since amalgamation. They have great context both in the area and in the business, the municipal finance business. So what's going to happen this evening? It's usually when we start moving into the steps of finalizing our development charge background study and passing that bylaw. We do bring our consultants. We don't have in-house economists or development charge expertise, so we do rely on Watson Associates to do this for us. We bring them in to provide council with an update on the process. It's a complex and very important process that most municipalities, especially high-growth municipalities, engage in. So this evening you'll be receiving a bit of a development charge 101, I guess, if you will, from Mr. Scanlon, who I'll introduce in a few minutes. And this is where just a step in the many steps that Mr. Scanlon will talk about to arrive at a new development charges background study and a bylaw to pass a development charge so that we can fund growth here in the county of Brant. So with that, I will introduce Gary Scanlon, who is the principal of Watson and Associates. He's worked with the county for a number of years, and he will be walking you through this evening's workshop. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And just before Gary takes over, I'll introduce his colleague is in the audience. Brian Tan is here to support Gary in his endeavor. Committee members, what I'm going to do is allow Mr. Scanlon to launch into his presentation. If you could just hold your questions, I'll try and break in at appropriate times to allow the committee to ask questions. So it flows smoothly, I just ask you to hold your questions until I break in to allow for questions. And I have one confused look on my, John,
Mr. Chair, through you, I was just going to suggest this is very important, and it's probably going to take longer than the 10 minutes, so I would move that we allow it.
This is why I call it a workshop, and it's not technically a delegation pursuant to our procedural bylaws, so this is more of a workshop. I've been told the presentation is about 15 minutes long, and allotting some time for questions. We should be moving on from this part of the agenda in about, I'll say, half an hour. So be patient, listen to the presentation, and I'll break in, and if there's any questions, that would be the appropriate time to ask them. Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Pleasure to be before you. There's development charges is defined by a piece of legislation, several regulations, and about 150 OMB hearings. So I'm going to try and collapse it down at a very high level, but to give you a flavor for the process that we need to go through in order to adopt a development charge bylaw. This is something under the Act. Your bylaw that you pass lasts for a maximum of 5 years, so we have to come back every 5 years to update the calculations. It's based on the growth, it's based on whatever the standards of the day are. This is just to quickly highlight the process we've been going through. We've been working with staff for a number of months. We're at early January right now. So we'll be looking to prepare the draft calculations. And as we have historically, is to have discussions with the stakeholder committee. We've been very successful in having a very good dialogue with them and proceeding through the process in a manner which has been very positive, very supportive, and the charges that we've adopted have not been appealed to the Ontario Municipal Board. And I think that's to the benefit of staff's engagement, the ability to talk with them, and I know that through the public process, I know that councils have engaged as well. So we'll be looking to have the formal public meeting, which is mandatory, in July, and then to pass the bylaw in August. So we'll be back before you on a couple of more occasions. Now, development charges are to recover the only capital costs. So it's for infrastructure. It's to build the roads, the additional treatment facilities, put in water mains, sewers, recreation facilities, build parks, etc., in order to accommodate the growth that will occur over time. And I'll give you a quick summary of the growth forecast later. The Act breaks the infrastructure really into two components. One component is very localized services which the developing landowners will build themselves. So within the subdivision, they'll put in the sewers, the water mains, the internal roads, street lights, sidewalks if it's an urban setting. So those costs are called local services, and they're defined under a section of the Act. Outside of that, then, there's all of those broader costs, the treatment facilities, the pumping stations, the water storage, parks, recreation facilities, etc. Those are then what we put into the development charge. So there is a cost directly to the developer, and then there's a cost which we include in the development charge and spread it across all the developments across the municipality. We've had development charges are certainly not new. They've been around since the mid-1950s, and they were originally put in under one clause under the Planning Act, but that was subject to many OMB hearings. And they were called lot levies back in the day because we could impose them at the time that you created a lot. So you severed a lot, or you ended up doing a subdivision, we could impose the charge. So that's where they got that moniker, lot levy. Since 1989, we've had an act called the Development Charges Act, and it's gone through several different phases. We had the first one in 1989 weave together all the OMB hearings and set out an approach to doing the calculation. 1997, there was a significant overhaul of the Act with the government of the day, and they introduced a number of reductions, deductions, limitations, so that a full-service municipality such as yourself really only recovers probably about the 75% of the cost of the growth. I'll go through quickly, give you a flavor for all those different reductions, deductions, and you see how we go from 100% recovery down to a range of about 75%. And then 2 years ago, under Bill 73, there was further changes. Bill 73 made changes to the Planning Act. It also made changes to the Development Charges Act. And recently, the province has started another process again, which we may see potentially further adjustments. So I'll be sending out a summary of what's been occurring over the last few months with the province. I'll be sending it to all of my clients, so we'll update you then. I won't get into it tonight because we're into a bit of a constrained time frame. So as I've noted, the current act, there were service limitations, service standard reductions, mandatory reductions, and mandatory exemptions that were introduced, and I'll go through some of those. The services that they eliminated in 1997 was basically the headquarters for general administration, so town halls or city halls type of thing. A lot of the building space or a lot of the staff space in there were eliminated. We can still recover for some of the space if it's for like public works or recreation staff, etc. But this is really the general administration of the municipality. They wiped out, for the most part, all of the arts and cultural sector. The only thing that was allowed to continue were libraries, so not only the facilities, but collection materials. Tourism facilities were removed, economic development. We used to be able to collect to contribute towards the expansion of the hospitals, considering 35 to 45% of hospital costs are raised locally in order to fund those hospitals, but we lost that opportunity. We can't buy parkland anymore. They deemed, I guess, that the Planning Act provisions were adequate, but over time that's been eroded as we need more density and development. We're getting less land now, but we have more people in a very small space, putting pressure on the need for parkland. And then the last one was they had eliminated all of solid waste. So incineration, landfilling, recycle, reuse was completely eliminated. And if I put any red lettering in there, these are things that have been adjusted as a result of Bill 73 2 years ago. So they've added back in this particular case, recycle, reuse, organics, everything except for incineration and landfill has been added back in. So it's a new service, as you'll see later on when I summarize the services we're including in this process. We've added back in waste diversion. Capital costs, you can see a detailed listing here. Basically everything you would need in order to undertake a complete capital project is what they've included in there. You've got land, you've got the buildings costs, equipment, even circulation materials for libraries, you've got studies. So it's a fairly robust definition of capital costs, and that helps us along for those services which are eligible. They did put restrictions for things such as vehicles and equipment. They want to make sure that they last 7 years or longer. They want them to be significant. They don't want, I guess, maybe some municipalities were putting in hammers and screwdrivers and stuff like that. So they're basically saying, look, it has to be a more significant type of equipment. So most, fire trucks and public works vehicles would be included in here. They did have an exemption for computer equipment. But in 1997, when they introduced this versus what we have today in computer equipment, completely different. And there have been OMB hearings that have gone on to have defined what is eligible computer equipment, and The case that we look at is one that said if the computer equipment is integral to the provision of the service, then we can include it. So obviously computers in vehicles are allowed. We can have the computers within treatment plants. It's police and fire, and you can see as of 2 years ago they've allowed transit now. We get to the end of the calculations and there's a mandatory deduct an extra 10%. So it's something they introduced. It originally was 40% for the soft services, 10 for hard services, but we can thank Hazel McCallion and her efforts and discussions with the province. Maybe very scary discussions, but at the end of the day, they took it from second reading to third reading, where now for those softer services, there's a mandatory 10% deduction. I think it was there to have municipalities contribute, so as a bit of an perspective that municipalities were using the money in that way. Anyway, long story short, there's a mandatory deduction there. Our planning horizons are basically 10 years for most services. Water, wastewater, storm, roads, police, fire, we can use longer planning horizons. And generally with water, wastewater, and if we use storm as well, we normally try and look at the areas that are being developed and take a look at the servicing for that particular area, because you want to look at the pipes, the treatment capacity, storage, etc. For roads, fire, and police, quite often we use more of a 20-year planning horizon. Capital costs, they're to be net of any grants, subsidies, other contributions. Once again, back in 1997, before local service realignment, downloading as they called it back in the day, there's been considerable reduction or almost elimination of most grants and subsidies. They're more ad hoc programs these days versus a fairly robust system of grants, provincial grants in the late 90s. These costs as well are, the last one talks about the costs can be incurred or proposed to be incurred, and they can be provided by others. Now I'll just explain it. Incurred and proposed to be incurred, most of the projects will have in the calculations are part of your capital budget or a part of master plans. So we're looking at the growth, and we're saying with that growth we're going to have to put in water capacity over here, wells, or treatment capacity, or pipes, or expand these roads. So most of them will line up with your capital budget or your master plans. But the word incurred also allows us, if you've debentured because we haven't had the money to pay for the infrastructure as we're building it. Normally water, sewer, you've got to build in advance of the development. So quite often we're issuing debt. You're allowed to carry forward those debt charges into our calculations, and we will be doing that. So that's eligible. So it not only pays for the capital cost, but we can also include the interest cost as part of that. And then the other part, you can either provide it directly or you can purchase that service off of others. And obviously you've got relationships with your neighbors, Brantford, where you're sharing of services, so they may take the lead on certain services and you'll contribute to capital. You may take the lead on other services and they'll contribute to you. So in those relationships, because there's a capital cost, you can also include that in your development charge. So there's no concern about not being able to pay for it through DCs. We spend a lot of time with staff on service standards, and the standards that the Act talks about comes down to a mathematical calculation. It's not the standards that your recreation people would talk about. We want to have one soccer field for every 1,000 people, or we want to have, for the library, 3 books per capita. Under the Act, it collapses down to a mathematical calculation. So those calculations require us to look backwards 10 years. We take a look at all the assets that you had. How many fire trucks did you have, and what's their replacement value? How many buildings have you had for recreation or for fire or for some other service? And we look historically and we look at those last 10 years, and that information allows us to calculate, it collapses down to a dollar amount per capita. And when we have that dollar amount per capita, we then multiply it by the growth. Let's say you're going to grow by 10,000 people, and that amount that we calculate is $1,000, then we multiply them that together. And it says over the planning horizon, in this particular instance, we'd be able to recover up to $10 million from the development community based on that calculation. Now, that doesn't mean that when we go through with staff, they'll spend, so to speak, all of that, but that's a way of the act limiting how much the development community will pay for. You'll pay no more than the average level of service that the municipality has provided to its residents over the last 10 years. So that's something. I'll present it, I'll give you a perspective. When we come back through the development charge calculations, we'll talk about that a little bit so you'll have some insight into what you provide today and what that you could be collecting. The methodology, in very, very simple terms, we take a look at the amount, type, and location of growth. So both residential and non-residential, obviously for water and sewer. You've got industrial parks that are going to need water and sewer servicing, just like in the urban areas, the residential homes will need it, or the commercial businesses. So we look at all of the growth, and that's the starting point for us to then take a look at the servicing needs for that. And the servicing needs translates into capital projects. And the capital projects, they may be in your 10-year capital budget, they may be in master plans and such. So we take that information and start to utilize it. We need to deduct any grant subsidies, other contributions, turn our minds to whether there's significant existing benefit to your existing people. For the most part, this is if we're knocking down a 5,000 square foot fire station and building a 10,000 square foot. The first 5,000 square foot would obviously be replacement. So that would be something that we would say, okay, that's a benefit to the existing development because we're replacing that. The growth, the expansion part, we would charge against development. As well, if we were going to put in water servicing into an area and there was a problem with inadequate fire protection, so we're putting up a new water tower, we would make a deduction to recognize that part of that water capacity is going towards overcoming an existing problem in the community. So that's how we look at that benefit to existing, and it's more project by project specific, and it's something that we do have a lot of discussions with the development community on each of the projects when we come through that process. We've got that statutory 10% deduction for the soft services we talked about. We have historic service standards that set an upper limit. And then moving from one bylaw to the next, we have to take a look at reserve fund balances, and we have to rationalize them relative to the rest of these calculations. We end up with a net project cost, or a net cost for each of the services. We must allocate it between a residential benefit and non-residential, and then we divide it back by the growth to come up with the development charge. So for residential development charges, we have a low, medium, high density charges, single and semi-detached, and the low, medium density for townhouses. Then we have apartments. And then for non-residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, we charge per square foot of building space. And very simply, this just identifies very graphically, we have the cost of the infrastructure divided by the growth. For the most part, with all the extra deductions and such, that's how we develop the infrastructure. It's looking at that, or the charge for development charges, looking at the infrastructure and parceling it against the individual growth.
Gary,
yes.
let's just stop there and see if there are any questions. At this point, it is very complicated, and we don't want to lose sight if there are any questions. And Steve has a question. Right on cue.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, through you to the speaker. Just back on methodology, just a quick question. Number one, identify amount, type, and location of growth over what period of time?
That goes back to the 10 years for those softer services, and we can use any planning horizon for water, wastewater, storm, roads, police, and fire.
Thank you.
David?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A quick question to Gary. You mentioned we do this every 5 years.
Yep.
From year to year, like we set the development charges per square foot, say for non-residential. Is that the same from year to year until we redo it again, or is that indexed for inflation?
Yes, the Act allows us to index the charge every year, and we use a construction index provided by Stats Canada. And what they try and do in that measure is take a look at the change of tender prices from year to year. So it's looking at, in real buoyant economic times, the tender prices actually go up faster than CPI, inflation. And we've even seen in recessions, it'll go a little bit negative because if the contractors are a little bit more aggressive in their pricing, they may drop. So it's not a bad index.
Okay, thank you.
And Mark has a question as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I have two questions. One, on slide 6, you talked about green bin services being eligible now.
Mark, could you just pull your microphone closer? Thanks.
Sure, no problem. In slide 6, you talked about green bin services now being eligible. So I'm wondering if you could chat a little bit more about that. I have another question as well. Just looking at the ability to increase development charges if we have a green bin program, is that only based on the last 10 years, or can we look at that sort of future forward?
We would do both. I mean, we're limited by the 10-year backward look, which that way of measuring service standards isn't always kind, especially if you're introducing new programs. But that sets an upper limit on what we can collect. Mm-hmm. What you spend in the future, obviously, is what council through the budget process establishes. It's limiting the amount we can recover by the service standards. Mm-hmm. So,
and I guess it may be related. Slides 8 and 10 discuss public transit, looking at ridership forecasts in one slide and then capital in the other. We're looking at developing a public transit system in the upcoming budget. I'm just wondering if we can add this to our developmental charges to defer some of the cost and lessen the burden to the taxpayer.
We can. We could. Okay. One of the things we need is through your transit now is a forward-looking service standard, and it's a little unique. We have to really look at what you've provided through your transportation master plans and your plans into the future, and how much of the growth and how much of the existing traffic do you want to allocate into transit versus how many are going to be continuing on automobile or perhaps other active transportation methods, bicycling, walking, and stuff like that. So we normally look to the transportation master plans to help look at that. Now, if we're not embracing it as of this time, we can come back in at any time and modify the bylaw to add that additional service. So we may not have the information, and we may look for you to initiate that service before we actually include it, but it would be isolated. We just come in and do an amendment. We have to do the public meeting and such, but we can add it in at any time. If we don't have it by August, we can include it later.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
And a final question for this segment, Joan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Mr. Scanlon. From May to December of last year, you've been meeting with our staff and looking at our growth forecast and reviewing our policies. Can you or will you be giving us a list of new areas that will be included for the next 5 years for development charges?
Yes. Yeah, right today I'll be giving you just a very high level summary of the forecast. But yes, we can break it out by individual area. And we have to look at the service areas versus the partially serviced versus the rural. So we have that information. Right. But I'll make sure that it's perhaps outside of this session, when we come to actually present the detailed calculations, we can focus in a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I was just really looking at number 1 there, which said Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, let's proceed, Gary. I think you were at the slide with the dollar sign right in the middle. That's the one.
That's where the rubber hits the road. Yeah. So the one thing I just want to point out is that with this, you have to keep in mind that even though we calculate the charge and we say X amount and we've got these projects, sometimes there's an expectation by development community, sometimes perhaps by council, sometimes by staff, that as soon as we have it, gee, we can just go out and build everything. But obviously, most of the services are looked at over a 10-year planning horizon, so we have to look at balancing it with your capital budget. So the DC wastewater storm, that has to be built before you get the development. So this is where we get into sometimes developer agreements in order to help the cash flow. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. Local service policy, this is, as I've noted, where the developer bears the cost of the very localized costs, like within their subdivision, internal water mains, sewers, roads, that type of thing, street lights. So we have developed in your existing bylaw, we've got a policy in there, fairly detailed, but I'm going to come back to Bill 73 because they have now said that you can't impose additional levies or the requirement to build development charges background study. So this is saying we've got to be a little bit more granular, we have to be a little bit more express on what the expectations are of the developer. And I'll come back to it, but one of the things we'll be looking at is a more detailed local service policy, and it'll be included in the background study, so then when we go out to the public, here's what the expectations are for you to build locally, and then here's what we've included in the development charge. And obviously, because of our public engagement process with the stakeholders, we'll have a lot of dialogue before we finalize that. There's mandatory exemptions, not a lot. Industrial buildings, if you have an existing building, you can expand by 50%, and they don't have to pay a development charge if you expand by that 50%. Thank you. Getting dry. Apologize. Now we can put limits around that. You can draw a line in the sand so that as you move forward, they only get one or up to 50% expansion, because we have had experiences where somebody goes from 100,000 square feet to 150, pull out another building permit the next day after they complete and have their inspection, and they just keep tagging it. So there has been OMB discussions, and we've got direction from that there's a certain way that you can draw a line in the sand and minimize that. Then with the residential development, you've got for single-family homes, an existing house can add up to 2 additional apartments, and as long as you don't more than double the size of the original building, then they don't have to pay for those apartments. Similarly, townhouse developments, you can add 1 additional development, or high-density apartments, you can add 1, and those don't have to pay the charge. The last one is to recognize a local government exemption. So in tier municipalities such as, let's say, Halton Region or Niagara, the upper tiers can't charge the lower tiers or the school boards. Similarly, the lower tiers can't charge the region or the school board. So there's each of the sectors can't charge each other. So you can't charge the school boards, they won't charge you for any of your buildings. And then the bottom part just talks about discretionary exemptions, and this is where you, as a council, can introduce additional exemptions if you wished in order to minimize the impact on certain types of development or certain classes of development. Probably the 2 most often we see is industrial exemption or reduction, or say churches, places of worship. Quite often we might see an exemption for that. If the charge is going up dramatically, we may see a phase-in over time. We give the development community some time to adjust their pro formas for those change in charges. And then the last one is just a redevelopment credit, which says, okay, if my house burns down, I should be given a period of time to replace it. Or if I knock down a building, I should be able to replace it within a reasonable period of time. So that's most municipalities in Ontario. It's a 4 or 5 year window. So when I take out the building permit, they look backwards 4 or 5 years. Was there a building there? If so, you would get some form of credit. Okay? Most of the exemptions, if you are giving them, you have to fund them. So it's a loss of revenue. But for this redevelopment credit, it's just really a replacement. You're taking away something and replacing it, like knocking down 3 single-family homes and then putting up 10 townhouses. So you're taking away the capacity, or you're replacing the capacity of the 3 single-family homes. Then there's some other matters. I won't get into a lot of the gory details on it, but there's excess capacity. If there's excess capacity of the system, the developers inherit that for, and they don't have to pay for it. And the cross-subsidization just